Late at night on March 14, 1944, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Sergeant William "Bill" Hartley crouched inside the shattered basement of an abandoned factory outside Cassino, Italy, studying a weapon so bizarre his officers had declared it the most foolish modification they had ever witnessed. He had wrapped oil-soaked rags around 6 crossbow bolts, sealed them using pine resin, and built a primitive ignition system from match heads and friction strips. The officers laughed at him. Fellow sergeants shook their heads. One lieutenant even ordered him to dismantle the device before he accidentally set himself on fire. But before 3 hours passed, Hartley would fire those ridiculed flaming bolts into a German command post, killing 7 officers, destroying their communication equipment, and causing enough chaos for 23 American soldiers to break out of a death trap where they had been pinned down for nearly a week. The Germans later called it Höhlenfeuer, hellfire. The Americans described it as the boldest improvised weapon attack of the entire Italian campaign. The crossbow itself was already unusual. A German hunting bow Hartley had discovered in a ruined farmhouse 2 months earlier. Built from compound steel, with a 60-pound draw weight and an effective range of roughly 80 yards, he had kept it mostly as a curiosity, occasionally using it for silent takedowns when noise discipline was essential. But the fire arrow modification was born out of desperation and from a childhood spent in the coal fields of West Virginia, where he learned everything about ventilation, airflow, and how flames behave inside confined structures. Hartley grew up in Beckley, West Virginia, the 3rd son of a coal miner who died from black lung when Bill was 14. By 15, Hartley himself was working underground, entering the same darkness that claimed so many men before they reached old age. The job was brutal and dangerous, but it taught lessons no school could provide: how to navigate in complete blackness, how to judge air quality by scent alone, how to recognize weaknesses in timber supports, and, above all, how fire behaves underground, consuming oxygen, creating explosive backdrafts, and turning wooden beams into fuel. Men who mastered these dangers were known as fire bosses. By the age of 18, Hartley was one of them. He was 26 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Married with a daughter and exempt from service because his work was considered vital to the war effort, he chose to enlist anyway. His wife refused to speak to him for a week. His explanation was simple: "Can't send other men to do what I won't do myself." The words sounded noble, but his real motivation ran deeper. He had watched countless miners die because decisions were made far from danger. He refused to stay safe at home, while others risked everything. At Camp Wheeler in Georgia, the Army discovered skills they had no category for. Hartley was a strong marksman, but not exceptional. Competent with a knife, but not extraordinary. What set him apart was his ability to solve problems under extreme stress and his instinctive understanding of terrain and structures, abilities that baffled his instructors. During one training scenario, he infiltrated a mock enemy site by crawling through a drainage pipe the officers hadn't known existed. In another, he silently eliminated 3 sentries using nothing more than a piece of wire and patience. His evaluation noted, "Unconventional thinker, potential asset in irregular warfare." The Italian campaign was irregular warfare turned into a nightmare. Hartley's unit, the 2nd Battalion, 36th Infantry Division, had landed at Salerno in September 1933 and had been bleeding ever since. Anzio, the Gustav Line, Monte Cassino, names that would scar survivors for the rest of their lives. By March 1944, they were trapped in the meat grinder of Cassino's town center, a medieval labyrinth of rubble where every building was a fortress and every street a killing ground. The operation that led to Hartley's fire arrow assault grew from 6 days of disastrous tactical decisions. On March 8th, Captain James Morrison led a reconnaissance patrol of 2 squads, 23 men, into the industrial district east of Cassino to locate German artillery positions. Briefings predicted minimal enemy presence. Intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Morrison's patrol walked straight into a fortified German strongpoint. Nearly 60 elite paratroopers from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had transformed several factory buildings into a deadly, overlapping defensive network. The Americans were hit immediately. Corporal Eddie Vasquez, age 20, from El Paso, was killed in the initial burst of machine gun fire. Private First Class Robert Chen, 19, from San Francisco, was torn by shrapnel and unable to walk. The remaining 21 Americans withdrew into a partially collapsed factory building with thick stone foundations. It offered good cover, almost too good. It made the perfect trap. The Germans didn't rush the position. They didn't have to. They surrounded it and established machine gun nests covering every possible exit, and waited. No food could reach the Americans. No water. No ammunition resupply. The enemy had time on their side. When Captain Morrison radioed for support, Division Command reviewed the situation and issued an order the survivors would never forget. Hold position. Relief force being organized.
That was March 8th. By March 10th, the trapped patrol was measuring out water by the capful. Morrison radioed again, his voice tighter, more strained. Men dehydrating. 2 wounded in critical condition. Request immediate relief. The reply from command was clinical. Air support grounded due to weather. Ground relief delayed. Enemy resistance too strong. In plain terms, it meant, you're expendable. Hold until you're overrun. We'll reclaim the position after you're dead. By March 12th, Private Chen was delirious from infection. Another man, Private Michael Kowalski, 22, from Detroit, stopped responding altogether. Classic dehydration-induced psychosis. Morrison's radio messages shifted from reports to pleas. Command's responses shifted from excuses to silence. On March 13th, American artillery attempted to suppress the German defenses long enough for an armored column to break through. It failed disastrously. 2 Shermans were knocked out. 14 more American casualties. The relief attempt was abandoned. Hartley overheard Morrison's increasingly desperate transmissions while he was pulling guard duty at battalion headquarters. He knew Morrison well. They had fought together since Salerno. They'd shared cigarettes during the stalemate at Anzio, argued over baseball and politics like brothers. Hearing Morrison's voice crack as he described his men dying of thirst while German troops laughed from 50 yards away shattered something inside Hartley. When his guard shift ended at 6 p.m. on March 13th, he didn't go back to his barracks. Instead, he went searching for the battalion intelligence officer. Lieutenant Peter Kowalski, no relation to the trapped private, was a former seminary student from Chicago, the kind of man who approached battle the way others approached chess. When Hartley found him around 7:30 p.m., Kowalski was poring over aerial photographs, shaking his head. "The German position is too strong," he said flatly. "Reinforced stone structures, interlocking fields of fire. Morrison's men are holed up in a basement with 1 exit. Any relief force will lose 2 soldiers for every yard gained." Hartley leaned over the photographs. The German command post was clearly identifiable, a 3-story industrial office building about 90 yards behind the frontline positions. Officers had been observed entering and leaving throughout the day. Communication cables ran from the building to the forward machine gun nests. Stone exterior, but wooden internal floors. Windows on every side. What if someone got to that command post? Hartley asked. Kowalski stared at him as though he'd suggested growing wings. Get to it? How? You'd have to cross 400 yards of open ground, slip past 3 machine gun nests, climb a fence, dodge roaming patrols, and then somehow enter a building with guards on every door. And once inside, what? Kill every officer with your bare hands? Hartley quietly produced his crossbow. Kowalski blinked. Is that a German hunting bow? Hartley nodded. Can you make incendiary devices? He asked. Kowalski frowned. Like grenades? Hartley shook his head. Like fire arrows. Medieval idea. Modern fuel. What followed was 2 hours of the strangest weapons development session of the entire Italian campaign. Skeptical but intellectually curious, Kowalski agreed to help. They raided the supply depot, parachute fabric, pine resin used as sealant, motor oil from destroyed vehicles, friction matches, copper wire. Hartley explained the mine school knowledge his father had passed down, how different materials burned, how to create sustained flames, how to avoid premature ignition. The design they built was crude but functional. Wrap the tip of the crossbow bolt in oil-soaked cloth, coat the cloth in pine resin for adhesion and waterproofing, fix match heads around the impact point. On contact, friction would ignite the matches would ignite the soaked cloth, the resin would maintain the burn. The resulting temperature would exceed 1200 degrees F. Wooden floors would ignite instantly. Paper maps would curl and blacken. In a confined space filled with officers in wool uniforms, surrounded by wood furniture and documents, the fire would spread before anyone could react. At 11 p.m., they tested one of the bolts in an abandoned quarry. It struck a wooden beam, sparks hissed, flames erupted. Within 12 seconds, the entire beam was blazing. Kowalski stared at the glow. "You're actually serious about this?" Hartley loaded another bolt. "Morrison's men have maybe 12 hours before someone dies of thirst. I'm not asking permission." Kowalski stood quietly for a long moment, then said, "The German patrol shift changes at 2 a.m. 30-minute window where everyone's distracted. That's your best chance." He pulled out a map and began marking points. Machine gun nests here, here, here. Roving patrol every 15 minutes along this route. Barbed wire fence 6 feet high. Command post guarded at the main entrance. Side door here looks less protected. Officers usually gather on the second floor.
Their observations of the light patterns inside the building were complete. Hartley took in every detail, the 400-yard stretch of broken terrain to the wire barrier, the 90-yard rubble-filled alley from the fence to the command post. Moving at infiltration pace, the approach would require 2 to 3 hours. His operation window was only about 35 minutes after the German shift change, before patrol routes stabilized again. If he was discovered, his odds of survival were exactly 0. At 11:30 p.m., Hartley returned to his barracks and wrote a letter to his wife. He didn't seal it. If he survived, he would tear it up. He prepared his equipment with the precision of a man who had already accepted the worst. Wire covers, a combat knife, a canteen, a compass, 6 fire arrows wrapped carefully in cloth, the crossbow, a morphine syrette for use only if captured. He knew exactly what the SS did to saboteurs. At 11:45 p.m., he slipped out of camp through a gap in the perimeter fence he had discovered weeks earlier. No one noticed him leave. The night was cold, around 38 degrees, with a half-moon often disappearing behind drifting clouds. Hartley moved through the shattered outskirts of Cassino like something spectral, using bomb craters for cover and timing each movement to the rhythm of moonlight and shadow. The entire area reeked of death.
bodies still buried under collapsed buildings, the smell of cordite and burnt timber, and that unmistakable metallic scent of blood-soaked soil. Every footstep had to be calculated. Glass would crunch, loose rubble might shift. A single misstep could be fatal. He covered the first 200 yards in 40 minutes, reaching the border of German-held territory at 12:25 a.m. From here, the approach became suicidal. Ahead lay open ground, a former parking lot pitted with shell craters, but offering almost no concealment. German flares periodically streaked into the sky, turning darkness into harsh white daylight for half a minute at a time. Machine gun positions appeared as darker silhouettes against ruined walls. Searchlights swept the terrain unpredictably. Hartley dropped flat and began crawling inside a shallow drainage ditch that ran roughly parallel to his intended path. Only 8 inches deep, it barely concealed a prone soldier, but it was enough if he moved only during darkness and froze whenever light swept over him. The icy mud soaked through his uniform in minutes. His hands went numb within 10. But the cold helped him. It masked his body heat, reduced the visibility of his breath, and kept him painfully alert. At 12:50 a.m., a German patrol passed within 12 feet of him. 2 soldiers chatted quietly about food and women, the eternal topics of bored troops. Hartley pressed his face into the mud and held his breath. Their boots crunched the gravel. One soldier stopped less than 6 feet away. Hartley could smell his cigarette. The soldier muttered something in German. Hartley didn't know the words, but the tone sounded casual. He'd probably noticed something small: a rabbit, a rock, a piece of debris shifting. Then the soldier walked on. Hartley waited a full 3 minutes before crawling again. The barbed wire fence came into view at 1:15 a.m., a stark, dark line against the slightly lighter sky. 6 feet tall, topped with 3 strands of wire, with posts spaced every 10 feet. The wire looked newly installed, no rust. German thoroughness. Hartley took out his wire cutters and began the slow, meticulous work of opening a gap. Cut too fast and the wire would snap loudly. Too slow and he'd be exposed at dawn. He treated each strand with the same practiced care he'd learned in the mines. Tiny cuts, controlled pressure, gradual separation. After 20 minutes, he had an opening large enough to squeeze through. He slid the cutters into his belt and began threading himself through the gap. The crossbow and arrows strapped across his back snagged once. He froze, freed them, and continued. A barb tore skin from his left hand, but he ignored the sting and pushed forward. At 1:40 a.m., Hartley reached the alley leading to the German command post. The structure towered overhead, a 3-story industrial office building from Cassino's manufacturing days, long before the town became a battlefield. Light glowed behind the second-floor curtains. Shadows moved. Officers studying maps, planning tomorrow's operations. The ground floor was quiet. By the side entrance, a lone guard smoked lazily, his rifle propped against the wall, classic bored sentry posture. Hartley assembled the crossbow in the shadows, hands moving by muscle memory. He loaded a bolt, drew the string back, locked it. Then he unwrapped his first fire arrow, examining the placement of the match heads in the faint moonlight. Everything depended on this working perfectly the first time. There would be no second shot. The second-floor windows were about 25 feet up and roughly 35 yards away, well within the crossbow's range. The windows were closed, but the glass was thin, pre-war commercial quality. The bolt would punch through easily. Inside were wooden floors, paper maps, and wool uniforms, and likely a few kerosene lamps, everything required for an instant inferno. At 1:47 a.m., the sentry lit another cigarette. The brief flare of his lighter illuminated his face, young, maybe 19, exhausted and cold. Hartley felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. The boy hadn't chosen this any more than the 23 trapped Americans had. War had simply placed them on opposite ends of a weapon. But the guard wasn't his target. The officers upstairs were. Hartley raised the crossbow, sighted along the crude notch, adjusted for angle and distance. His breathing steadied.
His hands were numb from the cold, but steady. Everything his father had taught him about making hard calls deep underground, about acting without hesitation, because hesitation kills, came together in that single moment. At 1:48 a.m., Hartley pulled the trigger. The bowstring snapped forward with a soft, almost delicate twang, barely noticeable under the ambient nighttime noise. The bolt arced through the darkness. 3 long seconds later, it smashed into the second-floor window. Glass burst outward. The match heads ignited on contact. A flare of orange fire blossomed inside the room. For 5 full seconds, nothing else happened. By then, Hartley was already loading the next bolt, his hands moving with practiced mechanical speed. Then a scream tore through the night, not a cry of agony, but of pure shock. Flames burst into full view behind the window, spreading even faster than Hartley had predicted. The pine resin burned hotter than expected, catching paper on the walls and leaping to the curtains. Shouts in German filled the air as panic erupted inside. Hartley shot the second bolt into the next window. More glass shattered, another bloom of fire. Within seconds, the entire second floor was a furnace. Flames licked the ceiling, devouring oxygen, breaking more windows with the pressure. Thick black smoke billowed outward. The sentry below dropped his cigarette, staring upward in confusion. Was this artillery? An airstrike? Hartley's third bolt hit the door frame of the building's entrance. The impact sparked instantly, flames crawling across the wooden door, sealing off escape routes. Now the structure was an inferno. Officers stumbled to the windows, outlined by flames, slapping at burning uniforms. One man attempted to jump, fell, and stayed still. Another leaned out and fired his pistol blindly into the dark, unable to see anything through the smoke but his own death closing in. Hartley sent the fourth bolt into a ground-floor window where he'd spotted movement. The scream that followed would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was cut short almost immediately. Fire roared through the lower level now, feeding on wooden furniture and stacks of paper. A chimney effect formed, sucking the flames upward and explosively spreading fire through the entire building. The fifth bolt went into another second-floor window. The sixth into the room with communication lines leading to it. Every arrow hit home. Every target ignited. Within 3 minutes, the entire structure was engulfed. Flames shot 30 feet into the air, visible for miles, turning the night sky a hellish orange. And then came chaos. German troops poured out from nearby positions, unable to understand what had happened. Orders were shouted, contradicted, ignored. Officers staggered from the building with smoking uniforms, trying to organize resistance or firefighting efforts. But there was no water, no proper equipment, only men waving coats and blankets at an unstoppable blaze. Machine gun teams abandoned their posts to help. The interlocking fields of fire that had kept Morrison's men trapped for 6 days simply evaporated. The German defensive net collapsed in minutes. Hartley did not pause to admire the destruction. He was already slipping back through the alley, crawling toward the factory where the Americans were imprisoned. He reached the steel door at 2:05 a.m. and knocked the prearranged pattern. 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick. The door cracked open. Sergeant Eddie Malone's gaunt, dehydrated face appeared, disbelief widening his eyes. "Hartley, what the hell?" "Move, now," Hartley whispered. "The Germans are distracted. You've got 5 minutes." Morrison appeared next, skeletal, uniform hanging loose, looking like a ghost of himself. "How?" he began, but the flames reflecting in Hartley's eyes gave the answer. "Christ, you hit their command post. Burned it. 7 officers dead, maybe more." "The machine gun teams are gone," Hartley said. "Your exit is open. Move." The 21 remaining soldiers stumbled out of the building. Private Chen, unconscious, was carried between 2 men. Private Kowalski was barely lucid, supported by comrades. They moved like the walking dead, starved, exhausted, half delirious, but clinging to survival.
The infiltration route Hartley had used was impossible for a group this depleted. He instead guided them west through the ruins, using the massive fire behind them, both as a distraction and a compass. German troops were still rushing toward the inferno. No one was guarding the perimeter. No one expected an escape in the middle of their own disaster. They were 200 yards into their escape before a German officer noticed shapes in the dark and shouted orders. Machine gun fire ripped across the terrain, but wildly, without aim. Gunners were disoriented, firing at shadows and rubble. Hartley shoved the group into a collapsed building for cover. "Stay down. Don't shoot back," he ordered. "Let them waste ammo." For 2 minutes, the Germans sprayed bullets at nothing. Hartley used the noise to move the group another 50 yards before the next lull. One sergeant muttered, "You're insane, Hartley." "Brilliant, but insane." They reached American lines at 2:47 a.m., staggering past astonished sentries who had been staring at the burning command post, baffled by what triggered the explosion of fire. Morrison collapsed almost immediately, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Chen was taken straight to medical. He would live, but he'd lose a leg. Kowalski needed 3 weeks to recover from dehydration-induced psychosis. At 3:15 a.m., Hartley stood inside the aid station, watching medics fight to stabilize the rescued men. His adrenaline finally drained, leaving him shaking. His uniform was stiff with frozen mud, streaked with dried blood from cuts he hadn't felt in the moment. The intelligence officer, Kowalski, appeared and handed him a cup of coffee quietly. Radio intercept confirms 7 officers dead, and the building is still burning.
German units were reporting the incident as a coordinated commando attack carried out by a specialized Allied sabotage team. They simply refused to believe that a single man with a crossbow had caused that level of destruction. Morrison had regained consciousness by then, sipping water in tiny amounts. He looked at Hartley and quietly asked, "Why?" It wasn't criticism, it was bewilderment. Hartley considered the possible answers: duty, loyalty, the simple truth that someone had to step forward, but he didn't say any of that. He only replied, "Couldn't listen to you die and do nothing." The aftermath quickly devolved into bureaucratic confusion. The battalion commander wanted Hartley court-martialed for abandoning his post without orders. The division commander wanted to decorate him for saving 21 Americans and wiping out a German command hub. The intelligence section wanted a full technical breakdown of his methods in case they proved replicable. The OSS sent an agent who interrogated Hartley for 2 hours about improvised incendiary techniques. Witness statements were filed within 2 days. Morrison wrote, "Sergeant Hartley carried out a one-man infiltration mission against impossible odds and executed an attack that achieved total tactical surprise. His actions directly ensured the survival of 21 American soldiers who otherwise would have died." 15 other soldiers submitted similar testimonies. German radio intercepts confirmed the deaths of 7 officers, among them a battalion commander, and the complete destruction of the command post and its communication systems. Hartley was nominated for the Distinguished Service Cross, but the award was downgraded to a Silver Star due to the unauthorized nature of the mission. He received it 3 weeks later in a brief ceremony where the division commander shook his hand and said, "Don't ever do anything that stupid again." Hartley made no promises. The rescued men went on to very different futures. Captain Morrison returned to duty within a week, led his company through the rest of the Italian campaign, survived the war, and resumed his law career in Pennsylvania. He named his son William after Hartley. Private Chen survived, despite losing a leg, returned to San Francisco, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children. He kept a photograph of Hartley on his desk for the rest of his life. Private Kowalski recovered from dehydration psychosis, went back to Detroit to work in auto plants, and attended every 36th Infantry Division reunion until his death in 1987. But the mission's significance went far beyond the lives directly saved. U.S. Army intelligence documented Hartley's improvised incendiary design, OSS field manuals added new sections about makeshift fire-based weapons. 3 similar infiltration missions were attempted in the following months. 2 succeeded. 1 failed when the infiltrator was detected. The Germans, alarmed by the vulnerability exposed that night, reinforced command post security across Italy, installed firefighting equipment, and issued orders forbidding wooden structures for frontline headquarters. Hartley survived the war. He fought through the remainder of the Italian campaign, advanced into southern France during Operation Dragoon, and entered Germany in early 1945. He was in Bavaria when Germany surrendered, 29 years old, miraculously alive when countless others were not. He came home to Beckley in July 1945. When he walked through his door and lifted his daughter into his arms, she didn't recognize him. He held her silently for nearly an hour. He never returned to the coal mines. After everything he'd seen, he'd had his fill of darkness. Using the GI Bill, he learned carpentry and opened a small workshop specializing in custom cabinetry. The work was peaceful, honest, worlds apart from the mines. He spoke about the war rarely. When neighbors asked, he brushed it off, did what everyone did, nothing special. But every year, on March 14th, without fail, his phone rang. Morrison from Pennsylvania, Chen from San Francisco, Kowalski from Detroit, sometimes others, men who had survived that basement, who had listened to their friends die of thirst until the night flames lit the sky and their salvation arrived in the form of a coal miner from West Virginia, armed with a medieval weapon and absolutely no regard for the odds.
Hartley passed away in 1983 at the age of 67 from heart failure. More than 200 people gathered in Beckley for his funeral. Morrison traveled from Pennsylvania to give the eulogy. Chen arrived in a wheelchair all the way from California. Kowalski's son came as well. His father had died the previous year, but insisted before his death that his son attend in his place. 15 other veterans of the 36th Infantry Division stood there too, men in their 60s, silent in the cold rain, honoring the man who proved that impossible was usually just another word for hard. Morrison's eulogy was simple. Bill Hartley taught me that courage isn't the lack of fear. It's choosing something else that matters more. For him, the choice was simple. He couldn't let us die. That decision saved 21 lives. It saved mine. He continued. He returned home, built furniture, raised a family, and never once claimed to be a hero. But heroism isn't measured by what a man says. It's measured by what he does. And Bill's actions spoke loudly enough. The men he rescued created a quiet legacy of gratitude that stretched far beyond that night in Cassino. Chen's children grew up hearing how their father survived, and why he kept Hartley's photograph on his desk. Morrison's son, named William in Hartley's honor, became a firefighter inspired by stories of last-minute rescues. Kowalski's grandson later wrote a college thesis on improvised tactics in World War II, using his grandfather's account as a primary source. Military historians have examined Hartley's mission for decades. The consensus is universal. It was tactically reckless, strategically unnecessary, and successful only through a rare combination of skill, desperation, and astonishing luck. When Special Forces attempted a similar operation under controlled conditions, their projected success rate was around 15%. Hartley succeeded where trained commandos could have failed, because he didn't treat the task like a standard military raid. He approached it the way a miner would. Identify structural weaknesses. Use whatever tools are available. Don't overcomplicate the solution. Today, the Fire Arrow Crossbow sits inside the 36th Infantry Division Museum in Texas, displayed behind glass, alongside Hartley's Silver Star citation and photographs of the burned-out German command post taken after Cassino fell. Visitors often ask whether the story is real. Museum staff point to the witness testimonies, after-action reports, German radio intercepts, and the accounts of 21 soldiers who survived only because a man they barely knew decided their lives were worth risking his own. Modern military doctrine now includes references to improvised weapons and emergency tactics, ideas shaped partly by missions like Hartley's. Special forces study historical examples of desperate actions that succeeded against all logic. The point isn't to glorify recklessness, it's to recognize that sometimes the impossible becomes achievable when someone refuses to accept that it is. If this story of ingenuity, desperation, and overwhelming odds resonated with you, please like the video. Subscribe to stay connected with more untold histories of ordinary men who achieved extraordinary things. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for helping preserve these stories.